Hi. Thanks for coming out tonight, and I'd like to thank 21C for being so nice to invite me, and all my friends in Louisville for being so warm and nice to invite me back. So for tonight, I decided instead of doing a boring lecture covering the work that I've done for the last 10 years, just to give you a little background, I consider myself a sculptor, and I did my undergraduate work at the Art Institute of Chicago, where I majored in photography and film, but kept sneaking into the sculpture department, and then did my graduate work at Yale, where I fully snuck into the sculpture department. And so I like to say I'm like a sculptor who cheats with film and photography sometimes. So what I'm going to show you today is this body of work called Decepción, which a big part of it is upstairs. And what I'll do is what we're going to do is kind of give you a story of how this project started. So this is a body of work that started about 3 years ago, and this led up into the show you see upstairs, which actually was by accident, and I'll explain how I stumbled upon that. So what happened is that at this point, about 3 years ago, I've been working, well, all my artistic life, I've been a studio artist, so I come up with ideas in the studio, I make things up. There are narratives, there are fantasies, there are fictions. I construct things. If there were photographs, if there were films, they're always set up to some kind of framework that I've designed. So at this point, I'm itching to get out into the world and kind of looking for an excuse to get out of the studio and interact with the world, because up to this point, I absorbed the world through books, films, ideas, and, you know, synthesizing all this stuff and then creating something in the vacuum of my studio. So now I want to go out in the world, and basically I'm interested in the history of photography, and I've always wanted to make landscape photographs. But the thing was that a landscape photograph is a cliche. To me, it's very cliched, and it's a trope that's exhausted. So I wanted to get out into the landscape with the camera, go on the road, and take pictures of landscapes. But it wasn't enough for me just to be able to go out to a vista and try to capture a sublime landscape on a camera. So I had to come up with some kind of device that would make sense to me in my imagination to kind of reinvent it for myself. So I indexed art history and thought about a very old trope in Renaissance painting, which is a window onto the world, a world within a world within a world. And I needed to connect it to my, let's say, my oeuvre of what I've been doing, which is my work. A lot of it works off of my biography, where I grew up, the cities I grew up, my family's history. Basically, my family is, I'm first generation, my families are immigrants, so there's a whole experience there that I tap into in my work. A lot of it has to do with growing up, my teenage years, my formative years, what I like to say before I knew what art was, before going away to college, was in an urban environment. So growing up in Miami, cars, automobiles were a big part of that teenage imagination. So I started to reference back to custom car culture, which I used to participate in that in high school. We used to trick out cars, lowriders, that whole subculture. So what I did here is I went off to a friend of mine who was actually on assignment, who was a photojournalist, was covering a truck driver convention in Las Vegas. And he had a press pass, and he invited me to come over with him, and I brought my large format camera, and I discovered then this world of custom Peterbilt trucks. So these are guys that put a lot of money and time into creating these very unique individual vehicles that they live and work in most of the year. So I went ahead and made a series of photographs of these cockpits, and that's when it dawned on me, well, these windows, these vistas can now be framed by the vehicle. So this started this investigation. This is about 3 years ago. So in a series of these, so then these are what you're going to see now are two photographs in one, and they're not constructed. They're constructed by me in the sense that the framing, the lighting, and the composition. But all these interiors are actual things in the world, and the landscapes are actual landscapes that I would find. So the photographs are made in two. It's a very long process where I find the cockpit, then I find the landscape, and then later I edit and marry them together. So this whole series, and here I'm still, if you can see in the background, I'm setting up things to happen in the landscape. Here it's a little small, you can't see it, but so there's a little bit it's somewhere in between of me in the studio and me out in the world. So I'm going out finding these real things, and then I'm also setting up scenarios that I'm superimposing into the background. Here, for example, this is the background is Machu Picchu. Before this one, this is a ghost town that's about 4 hours south of Los Angeles in an abandoned mining town. So I'm kind of looking, here the landscape still has remnants of civilization. So there is like this kind of thinking of post-apocalyptic narratives. So there is some kind of fantastic narrative happening in some of these. This being Machu Picchu, a ruin. And then about a year into it, I really started to deal with the landscape and predominantly the American landscape, and then looking at all the American monuments, because at that point I said, I want to go and actually experience all these American monuments with a camera. So then I start to go out to these very iconic, so I'm working off here memories of course, cinema, television, and of course, this is Monument Valley, which was made famous by John Ford films, and it's a very iconic landscape. So I married it with this. This is another Peterbilt truck. So here's where the landscape starts to really start to appear without civilization showing. So after that, I wanted to complicate it a little bit more, and the trucks aren't enough. So I start to think about, okay, vehicles in general. And the point of view always is this deliberate point of view where you're in the driver's seat or in the back seat, but you're complicit, you're projected into this space, which is something I like to do in my work, is to use visual cues or signifiers that can bring the audience in. Most people understand the experience of being in a car or some kind of vehicle with a cockpit looking out. And the prints, the photographs, as you'll notice upstairs, the scale is very deliberate, and it approximates, or a lot of times it is one-to-one to the car. So the photograph then takes on more of a physical, sculptural effect, because the steering wheel and the seats are close to scale if you were actually sitting in the vehicle. So the portals of the windows are rendering what you would actually see if you were inside of that. So at this point, I decided to turn looking at military vehicles, and to again add another layer of some kind of social layer. So this is a Humvee, an armored Humvee, the kind that's been deployed, for the last 20 years in the Middle Eastern theater. And this is one actually had returned and had been damaged. So all these vehicles have a very particular history and a very particular narrative. So everything is very loaded with that. And that was part of me leaving the studio, was to go and engage and experience actual people, actual stories and narratives. And it was a very different way for me to work. It became like this anthropological investigation. And I in no way think of myself as a documentarian or any kind of photojournalistic type of photographer, but that was happening, and you'll see how that progresses. Here, so then it moves on to historical military. This is a cockpit it's a reproduction, not the actual, of the Enola Gay, a B-29 bomber. Because at this point, I'm looking at, when I start with the trucks, the personalities are people who are obsessed with vehicles, hence they customize them, they live with them, they collect them. Here, I was dealing with individuals who collected militaria and actually restored full-size B-29s that they kept in hangars, private hangars in Connecticut or somewhere in Middle America, and sometimes they would charge an admission to see them. And again, the B-29 is a very iconic airplane for the history that it has, but also a reference, because what I like to do with the work is to have as many layers of reference in it, or at least what excites me, meaning we could go from art history to pop culture to social commentary and 0 to 60 in 1 second flat. So So the B-29, yes, it's loaded, Enola Gay. We have New York skyline, which I changed a few buildings so it doesn't read as New York. It's just a generic metropolis. But also, like, the pop reference here is the Star Wars trilogy, which is the Millennium Falcon cockpit, which is based on the B-29. This is a Huey attack helicopter flying, and that landscape is in Dubai, actually looking over the Arabian Sea, and those are oil derricks in the back, and that's a, and as I'm making these photographs, I'm thinking about the picturesque, and most photos are done at sunset or sunrise to capture that magic hour or to exploit that, as like what Caspar David Friedrich would do with his paintings, of trying to heighten the sublime of nature. But here, again, civilization is back in again, and that's a dust storm coming in from the, actually a sandstorm coming in from the desert, and as the sun sets. Here's the belly of a B-17 bomber, where they sunset probably somewhere in Arizona. This is a military DC-3. They called it the night train. So it was like it was like a military transport plane for, I believe for lieutenants or, for higher ups. And anyways, this point of view is shot from the Matterhorn in the Alps looking toward Italy. And in here, again, what they're basically, I think of them as still life and a landscape photograph. So the airplane is sitting on a tarmac, but now once you activate it with this landscape, there's all of these there's room for fantasy, there's room for imagination and narrative. Is it a ghost plane? Is it on autopilot? Is it parked? Is it a Photoshop? So all these questions come into play. This is yet another version of a B-25 Douglas looking over a gorge somewhere in Utah. And this one is more actually a direct reference, I think, to Star Wars, to the Millennium Falcon. So as I'm shooting the airplanes, I'm thinking, okay, iconic vehicles, cars that people may recognize, again, a more pop culture reference. And this is a replica of the Knight Rider car that David Hasselhoff would drive in that wonderful show. But the story about this one's very interesting, because every time I shoot one of these pictures, there's a whole interaction with the people who own these vehicles, which is not important to know when you see the images. But for example, this is a car. It was this man who's a teacher, elementary school computer teacher who lives in Long Island, who's obsessed with David Hasselhoff and Knight Rider. And he, at about $60,000 cost, has built a working replica of it in his garage. And so I connected with him, and he allowed me to take this photograph. And it's a fully functional car. And the funny thing, we talked about it. Here we get into the absurdity of the whole project, but which mirrors also the absurdity of the artist and what lengths artists go to do things. So the blue book value of this car is probably $3,000. He's dumped about 60 grand into this car. He says he makes about 40 grand a year as a teacher. But his level of obsession and of detail and I started to see the mirroring of their process with an artist. How an artist goes up to a studio and obsesses about some absurd idea that eventually turns into something that may have a meaning or not. So the meaning here is very specific to him, but just the act of it, I thought was a very beautiful thing, that he was obsessing about this car and created this very beautiful object that lives in a garage in Long Island. So I made a picture, and that's a sunset in Brooklyn. Here is it's like a Ford Focus, and this one is a little darker because that's a sunrise in Mallorca, Spain. What's interesting about this one is that these are custom cars. So here's where I shift now. I started with the semi-trucks. I move into military vehicles. I start getting into weird, interesting, quote unquote, iconic cars. And then here, I make a decision to actually return to what I knew as an adolescent in Miami, which is tuners, lowriders, custom cars. So at this point, I start to now go visit car shows and befriend car clubs, and I'm finding myself going back to Miami, going to Chicago, going to LA, and meeting these guys with very unique cars and start photographing these customized cars. So now, this is again talking more about customizing, because with the military stuff, it was about restoration and about preserving some kind of history. Now here, it's about individuality. These are people buying mass-produced cars, usually low price point cars, and putting 4 times the value of the car into it to customize it. And the value of the car is never, it's completely ineffable. Like, they couldn't get, the car's probably worth Blue Book $9,000, but the guy's put like 60 grand into the car, and he'll never get that money back. But that level, again, that absurdity about it, I found very interesting. So what happens with these cars is that there's an obsession. So I start to see all these little micro, what do you call it, these little moves or tropes within car culture. So there's a thing about packing as many TV monitors into a car. So it becomes these contests, because these cars go to contests and they get points by how many bells and whistles they have. So guys are putting flat screen TVs under the hood, by the motor, under the muffler. It gets really, it gets almost surreal. So this guy had all this battery of monitors and TV. So then what I did now is that I have now some artistic license to decide what is showing on the TVs. So here I've inserted frames, and every time you'll see a TV or some kind of monitor in these vehicles, I inserted frames. And now again, this information is not important to get the image, but what that is I have a collection of Cuban films that are from the 60s, 70s, and 80s that are bootlegs. You can't get them in this country legally. They haven't been translated. They haven't been transferred to DVD. And I started grabbing very particular screen grabs. And the nature of Cuba being such a political country, guess what? 90% of their cinema is political. So it involves some kind of narrative of protest, revolution, anti-capitalist narrative. So all of these scenes here, and you probably can't see it here because of the scale of the image, are very particular frames that if you study them have a very particular story. Like you get a very, but again, it's a layer that's personal for me. Now this is a vehicle that really drives home the point of what these vehicles really mean. In a way, they are functional cars. A lot of these cars are daily drivers. Some of them are just show cars, but they're these escape vehicles. These cars, these vehicles, in a way, were these fantastic release. It's almost like an escape valve for these owners of these cars, because they all have day jobs. I believe the owner of this car is a policeman in Miami. So each of them, they indulge in these masculine fantasies. So this guy, this is a Toyota Scion that he wanted to transform into some kind of a spaceship. And he curated this whole thing with his highly reflective surfaces, put all these lights. I made the image, and then I had this other image of the Grand Canyon, and the way it came out with the sunset, it kind of had some kind of, alien, Mars, extraterrestrial landscape. So it made sense to then go a step further to complete the fantasy of this car as some kind of a escape vehicle from reality. This is this is a Ford Escort that's been completely done up. And this, again, one more urban scenario. This is off the BQE looking to Manhattan, and that's a Brooklyn graveyard at in the background. Okay, so that's the lead up into the show upstairs to Decepción. And the title Decepción, what does that mean? It's a Spanish word for disillusionment, not deception. But I chose that title because of the possibility for the wordplay, that it means in Spanish to be disillusion, but it sounds like deception. And this is the first image that I stumble upon that starts the trajectory of the Decepción project. So I find myself in Miami following this car club that has some of the vehicles you just saw. And one of the guys said, hey, I have this cousin who has this very interesting, it's very cool, as he said, Cadillac Escalade, all white. You should go see it. And I said, okay. So I go see the guy, and he pulled it out of the garage, and the car is all white around. But then I realized that he's done the interior in Takashi Murakami Louis Vuitton. And I start to talk to him about it, and I say, do you know about Takashi Murakami and Louis Vuitton? And he's like, who the hell is Takashi Murakami? He doesn't care Takashi Murakami. It's all about Louis Vuitton. So I make the image. I go back home. I edit the image. I'm looking at it. And then I do a little more research, and I realize that at that point in car culture, in lowrider car culture, there is another subculture of people who obsess with luxury brands and make cars, design cars to be themed around luxury brands or faux luxury brand. Then I say at that point, I stop and I say, okay, this is going to be the new direction. Let me see how many cars can I find in America that are doing this kind of thing. So then that sets me off on a 2-year odyssey to try to find these cars, and it takes me all over the country. And so I stop at that point. So everything starts to shift, because before that, it's about customizing, it's about car culture, it's about subculture, but now it becomes really specific. Now it's talking about consumerism in a different way. Now it's talking about things that I've always been excited about and I'm always thinking about when I make my work. Class anxiety, race, all of this stuff is all in there, but it's not that obvious, at least I think. So this is the first image, and that leads me then to this series. So here, just to understand what's going on, these cars, mostly of them are older luxury cars. The people who are making these cars vary from a mailman to a drug dealer to a school teacher. And it goes pretty much across the spectrum of white, black, Latin, and Asian. And we're talking from Miami to Texas to outside of Detroit to California to the Northeast. And so it's happening all across the country. And mind you, within the car culture, it's a very small subsect, and you will see them in car shows, but that was part of why it was so difficult to find these cars. Okay, so here the landscape, that is Death Valley. And this image of Death Valley is what you see in the foreground of the rear plate is a abandoned water theme park. Somebody had an idea of, and this is probably, I think the nearest center is probably 20 miles away, and the nearest exit, the exit you have to get off to get to this is about 5 miles off. Someone decided to build a water theme park, like a Six Flags Atlantis, in the middle of Death Valley. Well, it didn't work. So it was a very, and now it's been stripped because that area is populated by crystal meth labs and crystal meth heads. So this whole area, they've descended upon this place and are slowly stripping it down of anything that they could sell, like all copper and metal. So it was really sad, because here was like like a dream, someone's dream, like dried up in the middle of the desert. And to where I am, the vantage point that I'm taking the picture of the landscape is on a 8-story tall water tank, which I guess they were planning to fill it up with rainwater to pump into this park that never was. The car is owned by a mailman, and it's an old, I think it's like a mid-'80s Mercedes that has, see, another thing with the images, to tell you how I shoot them with a large format camera, so there's a lot of detail in these, so you could see you can actually read the odometer readings. All these cars have high, so it's like a Mercedes with 400,000 miles on it. So here we move now to the different brands, and each brand means something. So this is a couple who actually had this, so a lot of a husband and wife team had come up with this car, and she loved Coach. She identifies with Coach. So this car was made together by them. And the background, that's Lake Michigan in mid-January, frozen over. And here, this image is important because to this point, I am photographing inanimate objects. I'm just shooting cars, it's still lives, and landscape. But I'm meeting all these very interesting characters, but I'm deciding not to turn the camera on them until I meet the owners of this car who have actually gone ahead to customize clothing, shoes, hats to match the car. So they don't allow me to make their portrait, but he allows me to take a picture of his shoes that match his car. Then at that point I realized that there's a whole other world within this world, that these people are not just stopping with the cars. They're making clothing, they're making furniture, they're doing decor and interiors of homes. And then I decided at this point, okay, as I'm photographing the cars, I will try to document the rest of that culture. This is the Burberry, this is again, an early 80s BMW 5 Series, I think, done in Burberry, and the landscape is Imperial Sand Dunes in Southern California. This is a Caprice Classic. Again, large domestic cars are very popular. Lincolns, Cadillacs, Chevys. Pre-1992, that is the Grand Tetons. Here, this is a Ford Explorer that was done in Chanel, and the landscape, this is the only one that has a direct reference to any kind of art history. That's Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson, which again, that was a personal, for me, because I did I did the trek. I wanted to go out and experience Spiral Jetty, spend a day out there and make a picture of it. And then later on, I found a car that would actually match it, would match up with it. So here, again, we're going from 1970s land art to that car. Here is a Cadillac in Louis Vuitton Steven Sprouse pattern. And there's an image in the center of a protest going on in one of those Cuban films. And the landscape is in the Swiss Alps. It's a lock that's probably 6,000 feet above sea level. Okay, so now here we move into the people. And a lot of the people, they did not want to be photographed. They did not want to be identified. A lot of them were shy, a lot of them, because we have to understand that this is now an economy of fakes. This is all illegal material. So they know that they're trafficking in something that's trademark infringement. So this is the brand, I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, it's an old German brand that was very popular in the 80s called MCM. And this guy, what they do, I discovered how they do it, they source from China by the yard the raw material, the vinyl, the leather, the linen, and then they'll make whatever they're going to make. So this guy had yards and yards of this material, so I pinned it up in his bedroom and had him pose with this. He had created this leather jumpsuit and hat to match. This lady, actually the owner of that dress, refused to pose, but her friend didn't mind. So that's not the owner of the dress, that's her friend. And that is a Dolce & Gabbana dress that she had created for a prom. So that's a prom dress. And this is now the interesting part. This photograph is not a square. It does have that arc on the top, so it's a reference of Barclay Hendricks paintings, but also references Renaissance paintings that use that kind of framing device. She also had a backpack made out of the same material that she was wearing with the dress. So again, these interesting choices. So what I was finding is that what people were doing is that even though these luxury brands index wealth or some kind of socioeconomic positioning, they weren't interested in mimicking or trying to pass off as a fake. They were appropriating that material and now interpreting it into their own way. They weren't trying to copy things in magazines or at the store. So this is parallel to the forgery market of knockoff bags that you could buy online from China. Just to give that interior, that is a man's bedroom that was, I'm assuming he built it in the 80s and had this kind of drug dealer fantasy Versace bedroom complete with a hot tub. here, this man did not want to be photographed, so I cut him off at the head, and he had these Timberland boots. He liked to do asymmetrical styles, he called it. And so those boots, one is in Gucci and the other one is in Fendi. So he had these upholstered to a match. So as I'm meeting these people who are doing this, I keep looking, and then I find in urban areas furniture stores that have rooms with this illegal designer furniture. So here we have a Chanel couch, or no, Chanel, seat. Here's another lady who had a Louis Vuitton dress with matching bag. It's some kind of flamenco interpretation. And interesting, again, she's not trying to do any kind of like couture. This is her interpretation of how this dress should be for the wedding that she was going to attend. This is a setup at one of the furniture stores, a complete set of Chanel, and I love the mural in the back. How much? Expensive. Expensive, like that. Just the bed, I think, was like $8,000, and each nightstand was like $2,000, and it's like made in China. It's like incredible. Here's a love seat. Okay, so here we're coming toward the end of it. As I get deeper and deeper into this, then I start to meet the people who are making this. And this is this economy, this black market economy of people in their garages and sweatshops and, and basements. And these, for example, this is at this lady who was making these dresses. That's how I got through the lady who had that dress. She eventually trusted me enough to connect me to the lady who was making the dresses. And this was scraps on the floor of her atelier, you could say. This was at a car customizing shop where they have this makeshift sample board where you can pick your brand. So they had these little swatches that you could, point to and have your car done in. This is the little sweatshop where they're making the dresses. This is in Florida. And the lady made me promise not to say because, again, like she didn't really want to be identified, but this is in Florida. And these are all images that are in the book, but because at the end of the project, I probably had about 35 images, and I culled it down to what is in the book and then in the exhibitions. And these actually, I've never shown these images publicly. These are ones that didn't make it into the book, but are these little, and I think it was more because she didn't actually want to be, I took the picture, but then she said, I don't want to be identified. And this is the guy who was doing the boots. And that is the slide. So now I'm going to show a short film that I did, and it has nothing to do with what you just saw. But I'll give you a little quick background on it. So this movie is from, I believe, 2004, and it's about a 7-minute film, and it's very different from how I'm thinking these days, but the film, just to give you a little background, it's about two worlds colliding, high meeting low, and the story, if there is a story, it's an experimental film. It's inspired or based on dreams, nightmares that I've had, mixed in with childhood memories, and then indulging in those ideas. And the story, I would say, is about a very special, gifted a girl who's 8 years old. And just to give you a background, she is the product of an affair that happened between a museum guard and a patron of the arts. And the film was shot at the Whitney Museum, and we used the Whitney Museum's collection, and it was then later premiered at the Whitney Museum. And the film travels in this kind of dreamscape. It's kind of, I like to think of it as like a visual trip, loaded with a lot of information, but hopefully fun. So we could maybe just fire up the video.